week, the theme of our evangelistic series has been, what are you running from? Or, if you like being grammatically correct, from what are you running? That's bothering me all week. But we've all been taking stories from the Bible of people who've been running from something. Stories of people running from responsibility, from God, from their calling. And tonight for my story, as Pedrito mentioned, I'm going to be covering the story of Peter. And we probably have the most written about Peter than any other disciple of Jesus in the Bible. Like, Peter was a pretty popular dude. You might even have seen him on campus. I brought a picture of him. If you can pull that up. Uncanny, right? The resemblance there. Find him on Spotify. So there's a lot to say about Peter, and there's a lot I could say, but I don't have a lot of time. And there's just one part of his story that I want to cover. But in order to give you the full picture of who this Peter guy was, I'm going to recap his character a little bit. Now, I think the reason that Peter was so famous, or why we have most written about him in the Bible, is because he always said the wrong thing at the wrong time. He was an impulsive guy. He was reckless. He was stubborn. And he often had his foot in his mouth because he said the wrong things at the wrong time. And where we're at in his story, I'll give you a recap. So where we pick up his story, or where we last saw him, was in a courtyard adjacent to where Jesus was on trial. He's standing in the courtyard waiting to see something, or what's going to happen to Jesus. And while Jesus is being interrogated and Peter's watching, someone comes up to him and asks, "Aren't you one of his disciples?" And Peter says, "No, that's not me. You got the wrong guy." A second person comes up to him and says, "Aren't you one of Jesus' disciples?" He says, "No, you've got the wrong guy." And then a third person comes up and says, "Now I know you're one of his disciples. I've seen you with him before, haven't I?" And Peter says, "No, I'm not one of his disciples. I've never met him. I've never met Jesus." And this was fulfilling what Jesus said Peter would do. He would deny him 3 times before the rooster crows. And when Peter realized this, the Bible says he went out weeping bitterly because of it. Now, we can imagine what Peter was feeling at that moment. Probably feeling like a complete failure, feeling guilty for having denied his friend, feeling sadness for such an utter goof up. And even deeper than that, I can imagine Peter feeling thoughts of self-doubt and of self-hatred for this despicable thing that he'd done. The one thing he said he wouldn't do, he said, "Jesus, I'm going to be with you to the end." But he couldn't keep his promise. And feelings of self-doubt and hatred must have been creeping into his mind. Maybe you can relate. I'm sure many of us can. A study has shown that nearly 85% of the world's population has dealt with or deals with low self-esteem issues of some sort, in some form. And I can raise my hand to that statistic, because I know I have. I have suffered from low self-esteem, from self-doubt, self-hatred, and feelings of complete and utter worthlessness. And this all started in me at a very young age. I was about 8 years old. And we were coming home from school one day, and we were told that my dad was gone, and he wouldn't be coming back for a while. And I wouldn't know why for a very long time. And for some reason, this changed something in me, something foundational. Because the way I saw myself began to change. Because when I went to school, and the other boys were talking about sports or cars or guns or things that they would do with their dads, I couldn't relate because mine was gone. So I felt left out and alone. And like there was something wrong with me because I didn't have a dad at home. Now, this affected everything about me. It even affected my posture. Well, what would happen is I just formed a habit of putting my hands in my pocket and always looking down at my feet because I had no one to look up to and nothing to look forward to. And this trend, this distorted thinking that I had continued to spiral downward and downward throughout elementary and high school until I had absolutely no confidence in myself. I had no self-esteem, and I thought that I was completely worthless. So I can relate to what Peter must have been going through in this instance. Feelings of complete dejection, feelings of utter failure, and feeling utterly worthless for what he had done to Jesus in denying him. That's where we last saw Peter. But where we're going to pick up his story is in John chapter 20. I'd invite you to pull out your phone or your Bible and turn to John chapter 20, and we're going to pick up the story there, starting in verse 1. I'll read the first 2 verses. Now on the first day of the week, Mary Magdalene came to the tomb early, while it was still dark, and saw that the stone had been taken away from the tomb. So she ran and went to Simon Peter and the other disciple, the one whom Jesus loved, and said to them, "They have taken the Lord out of the tomb, and we do not know where they have laid him." I'm going to stop right there and unpack this a little bit. Imagine with me, Mary comes busting into the room where the disciples are. And they're all huddled together in fear because they don't want to be discovered and crucified as well for having associated with Jesus. And Peter's off in the corner, wallowing in his self-doubt and his utter failure. And I can only imagine Peter asking himself questions like, how could I have let Jesus down in such an awful way? How did I ever come to this point? Why did he ever think he could trust me? I'm such a loser. But Mary comes busting into the room, and she tells them that Jesus isn't there. He's been taken from the tomb. And so we'll pick up the story again in verse 3. After Peter hears this, it says, "So Peter went out with the other disciple, and they were going towards the tomb. Both of them were running together. But the other disciple outran Peter and reached the tomb first." Now, I don't know what happened in Peter's mind when Mary came in and told him this, but something in him changed. He decided to get up from where he was, close up the pity party that he was having, and run to see what Jesus has done. Now, I can only speculate why this is. Maybe it was from excitement. Maybe it was from fear. Maybe it was from the mystery of it all. Maybe it was just a part of Peter's impulsive attitude. But something in him changed. Something triggered him in him. And it made him get up from where he was and run, leaving behind his doubt and his fear in that upper room and running to the tomb to see what Jesus has done. Now, verse 4 kind of trips me up a little bit, how it says that the other disciple outran Peter. And there have been speculations about why this is, probably because Peter was a bit older and the other disciple was a bit younger, so he had youth on his side to carry him all the way. But I like to imagine that Peter's running and the other disciple is outpacing him. And Peter thinking to himself, man, I can't even keep up. I'm such a loser. I don't measure up to these other disciples. Nobody else denied Jesus, only I did. I don't measure up. But it's not about how we measure up. It's not about how Peter measured up to the other disciples. It's not about how we measure up to others. It's not about how our negative thoughts transform how we shape our self-worth. It's not about that. What got Peter out of that room is what Jesus thought about him. That's what it's about, what Jesus thinks about him. And without a word having been spoken to Peter or the disciples about what Jesus thought about them, we can know from that open tomb what Jesus thinks about us. Because Jesus loved us enough to come down and be here with us. Jesus loved us enough to willingly go to his death and to his grave. And Jesus loved us too much to stay there.
Amen.
He loved us too much to stay there. And if there's one thing I want you to take away from this is what it is. It's not about what I think about myself. It's not about what you think about yourself. It's not about how you measure up. It's about what Jesus says you are worth. And I'm going to put my money where my mouth is and give you a little illustration. So I have a $20 bill, Mr. Jackson here. And what if I said, anyone can have it. I will give it to someone. Whoever wants it. Just raise your hand if you want it. Right? It's money, of course you want it. But I'm not done with it. What if I crumple it up? Who wants it? You still want it. All right. What if I take it? Rip the corners. Just one corner. Crumple it up again. Who still wants it? Joey wants it. It's money. Rusty wants it. All right. What if I take my pen? Scribble a little bit on it. Who still wants it? Raise your hand if you still want it.
That's an autograph.
This is worth something, right? Why do you still want this after all that I've done to it? Because someone with authority higher than you or me ascribed to it value. What if I were to tell you? What if I were to tell you that this $20 bills was used in a drug deal, or it was used to buy alcohol, or a prostitute, or used to buy a child slave? You might not want it so much anymore. But it still has value, because an authority higher than you or me ascribed it value. Because nothing that is done to or with this money can deteriorate its value.
Amen.
If there's something I want you to take away from this, it's that you are the same. Someone with authority higher than you or me has ascribed us value. In the words of the Walla University philosophy, we are made in the image of God and of inestimable value. And nothing that is done to or that we do, nothing that is done to us or that we will do can change that value.
Amen.
Because it's not about the wrinkles, it's not about the scars, it's not about the bruises, it's not about the cuts, it's not about the ink, it's not about what the scale says, it's not about what your GPA says, it's not what your credit score says, it's not what you say to yourself in the mirror. It's not about that. It doesn't matter, those things. They don't ascribe value to us. Because someone with authority, someone higher than you or me, has ascribed value to us. What matters is what Jesus says you are worth. I'm going to close up here by giving an appeal. If you have struggled with self-doubt, with self-esteem, with self-hatred, with confidence, then I urge you, run away from those doubts. Leave them in that hiding place that we so often go to beat up on ourselves. Leave them there and run to the open tomb to see what Jesus thinks about you.
Amen.
If any of these nights has spoken to you in any sort of way, then I would urge you to make that decision to run towards Jesus, to run to what he thinks of you, and he will tell you your value. If you are fine with your self-image, if you have all the self-esteem in the world, that's great. I urge you still, run to Jesus so you can find that ultimate value that he has placed upon you. And as we transition here, I'd like to invite Peter up here to make one last point. In verse 4, it says both of them were running together. If you struggle with self-esteem or self-worth, I would urge you, do not run alone.
Amen.
We have these cards that says you can talk to someone. Right on the back of it, ask for prayer or for someone to talk to, because we don't want you to run alone. But run to the one who has given you value.